That video clip that you saw was of the largest park in the lower 48 states, and that park was actually in New York. It was not a national park, it was a state park, the Adirondacks. And the unusual thing about that park is that you'll find some towns in there. The place where I went to sleepaway camp was in there too. And the Winter Olympics in 1980 was there too, in Lake Placid. And this podcast has to do with parks and nature preserves. And the learning target for this podcast is to describe how parks and nature preserves aid in preserving biodiversity. First, this park here is Udall Park Preserve, and it's a New York City park in Little Neck, and it's one that probably almost nobody knows about, including many people who it's used solely for wildlife and for the habitat. You won't find any ball fields there, you won't find any playgrounds, you won't even find walking trails. I did take this picture. The pylons that you see there is for a dock from decades and decades ago, probably even it was used in the 19th century probably. And it was used for people who were clamming. The picture you're seeing here is what you're seeing at low tide during a full moon. So the water's lower than it usually is, and if you came back about 12 hours later, the area which is all covered with mud would be. So this is a salt marsh, and about 80% of New York City's salt marshes have been destroyed. And around Manhattan, all of them have been destroyed except for one, and even that one is not a natural one. And that one is at the northern tip of Manhattan in Inwood Park. So this park here preserves the salt marsh ecosystem, and that is one of the purposes of parks and preserve, and it's preserve the ecosystems that are there. And here are the states of parks nationwide. There are more than 1,100 national parks in 120 countries. Venezuela has the highest proportion of its land protected, that's 70%. The United States has 15.8%. I think overall, in an overall area, I think Brazil has the largest. Unfortunately, many of these parks are paper parks, and that means that they really only exist on paper, because in developing countries, while these parks have very high biodiversity, there's little protection that they can give from poachers, loggers, and miners, because they don't have enough money to keep them away, or they don't have the personnel in order to protect the parks.
It is a better world with some buffalo left in it. A richer world with some gorgeous canyons unmarred by signboards or superhighways, undrowned by power or irrigation reservoirs. If we preserved as parks only those places that have no economic possibilities, we would have no parks. And in the decades to come, it will not be only the buffalo and the trumpeter swan who need sanctuaries. Our own species is going to need them too. It needs them now. Wallace Stegner.
Since its beginnings in the mid-19th century, the national park idea had embraced two equally important, yet apparently contradictory thoughts: that the parks should preserve America's special places in their natural conditions forever, and that they should be open and accessible for the enjoyment of all Americans. Early park leaders had glossed over any paradox, arguing that the best way to protect the parks was to build public support for them by encouraging more and more visitors. But with the end of World War II, as the parks neared their 100th birthday, and an increasingly affluent and mobile nation placed demands on them as never before, the balancing act between preservation and use would be severely tested.
There are conflicting purposes for the parks, as you saw in this video, and here are two pictures that I took in Yellowstone. The one on the left, you see that we have ecotourism, where people come to parks just to see the wildlife, and these are people waiting to see Old Faithful glow, and I was one of them. And on the right, you see the wildlife that is being saved, the bison. So here are some conflicting purposes. On the one hand, there's tourism and recreation, and those things can bring hotels and traffic jams. And all-terrain vehicles, these are things that are able to drive off the roads. They'll run over a lot of things, and they can destroy a lot of plants and can damage the ecosystem. And snowmobiles can do the same type of thing. And there's hunting, mining, logging, and also there are people who live in some parks, like I mentioned with the Adirondack Park. And on the other side, the parks are meant to preserve endangered habitats and species and to keep the ecosystems in their natural state. Now, worldwide, the World Conservation Strategy is one to maintain essential ecological processes and life support systems on which human survival and development depend, and also it's meant to preserve genetic diversity essential for breeding programs and to improve cultivated plants and animals. It's important, like, for example, let's say there's a disease or a pest that's wiping out bananas, which don't have a lot of genetic diversity because they reproduce asexually. We could go into the wild and we could find close relatives to it that are in the tropical rainforests, and then we could genetically engineer a gene that we found that's resistant to it in those and put it into the banana crops. Or if we're working with the species that's sexual, like for example weeds or coffee, then we could just crossbreed it. Like there's a preserve in Ethiopia. One of the purposes of that preserve is to keep wild coffee plants around in case something happens to their coffee crop. The third purpose is to ensure that any utilization of wild species and ecosystems is sustainable.
The national parks are extremely important for several reasons. One is that they are selected to include a large part of America's biodiversity. People, when they come here, they learn about America's natural heritage, particularly the living part of our national heritage. They're going to see ecosystems too, and they're going to see natural ecosystems. And from that, they're going to get an idea of what the place is all about. I think if you see a bear, a group of elk, or an alligator swimming across a lagoon, I think the vast majority of people are going to want to know more before they go out that exit. It allows people to see it, understand it, and love it. It becomes a theater for acquiring further knowledge about this whole part of the environment. And they're very important because they are natural laboratories for research. We are studying them in order to find out how ecosystems are put together. We really need to know what it will take to make a sustainable world. The array of parks, from the Everglades to the great parks of Alaska, Yellowstone, and on down into the desert regions and canyon parks that are near urban areas and the southern Appalachian, all that immense diversity found within our national parks, embrace a very large part of the totality of the biodiversity of North America.
Now, unfortunately, very little area is actually protected. We've already gone over the paper parks. In addition to that, a lot of the officially protected area is actually lower than it really is, because a lot of the officially protected area can be ice, tundra, or desert. Like a lot of Greenland is officially protected, but a lot of Greenland is ice. Quite a bit of Saudi Arabia is protected, but a lot of that is desert. So it doesn't take a lot to really protect it when nobody really wants it. Fortunately, organizations which will try to reverse this, like the Nature Conservancy is one of those, and it's a non-profit international organization, and one of the things that it does is it purchases lands to preserve, and there's a little video about what they do.
With your support in 2012, the Nature Conservancy worked around the world to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends, pursuing solutions to the world's greatest conservation challenges. We protected and restored nature, from southern Chile, where we contributed 24,000 acres to help create the Alerce Coastal National Park, which protects some of the world's last temperate rainforests, to Maine's Moosehead Lake region, where a partnership among the Conservancy, Plum Creek, and the Forest Society of Maine secure the second largest conservation easement in U.S. history. Working across borders, the Conservancy's Montana and Canada programs worked with a Canadian non-profit to halt the threat of mining and add nearly 400,000 protected acres to the magnificent Crown of the Continent project. We also work to enable all sectors of society to use nature more sustainably. In China, a new eco-partnership agreement between the Conservancy's Great Rivers Partnership and China's Yangtze River Basin Fisheries Resource Management Commission is improving the health and management of both countries' rivers. In Tanzania, the Conservancy supported local partners to enable the nomadic Hadza people to legally document and protect more than 50,000 acres of their wilderness homeland. And we work to unite people and expand support for nature. Our premier youth program, LEAF, expanded to 8 U.S. states this year, exposing scores of urban youth to the wonders of nature through internships at Conservancy preserves.
In 1986, UNESCO started the Man and Biosphere program, and that is to make biosphere reserves. And as you see in this diagram here, in the center you have a core area that's surrounded by a buffer area, and that's surrounded by a transitional area. And what this does is it combines conservation with sustainable use of resources through the use of those 3 zones. That core area is the most protected area. It can't be used for all that much. It's just used for research and other things that minimally affect the ecosystem. The buffer area that goes around it can be used for research, it can be used for ecotourism, it can be used for education. And then the transitional area, it can be used for people can live there, there can be sustainable agriculture in there, there can be other industries that will not really affect the ecosystems. Now, one problem that definitely happens as we expand into areas where we really aren't, that is habitat fragmentation. And you can see that in this diagram here. Like on the left, we have inside of a nature preserve, and on the other, and then outside of that is outside the nature preserve. Inside, there's no habitat fragmentation, and outside, there's a lot of habitat fragmentation. What can be done to preserve the species when the habitats are fragmented like that? A fragment can be just as simple as a road splitting a population in 2. And also, what happens if the preserve that's set aside is too small to support some species? Like some species, like tigers and elephants, need a very, very large-sized habitat in order to survive. This is where we come into landscape ecology. If you look at this diagram here, and I believe this is in Kentucky, and you see here how these areas of forest, which are natural reserves, these areas are fragmented and they're in different shapes. This fragmentation is sort of like making islands, where the species that live in the forest can live just in those areas. And also, don't forget, you also have the ecotones. On the edge areas, there are species that only live in those edges. So you need to know if that reserve is large enough, and if the core is in the center part of that reserve, is that core large enough to protect the species? And if you can't have a large reserve, could you have a series of smaller preserves which are connected by corridors? Small reserves are also called patches, and the size and the shape does make a difference. And if you look at this diagram here, this tells you which size and shape is better. In general, circular tends to be better than rectangular, because the circular tends to give less surface area, so there tends to be less on the edge and more towards the core. And also larger tends to be better than smaller, because that means a larger proportion is going to be on the interior and less is going to be on the edge. Now for a corridor will link the patches together, and that will allow species to travel between the patches. The problem with that is that the predators will tend to congregate on the corridors, because that's where they're going to find their prey. So that the corridors need to be wide enough that the preys don't get funneled and they don't get killed by a lot of the predators. And the picture that you see over here, this corridor here, is most likely too narrow, so that will have a negative impact on the wildlife that's there. Now we come to our concluding questions. Number 1, why are many of the world's parks paper parks? Number 2, how do tourism and preserving wildlife conflict? Number 3, what is a biosphere reserve? And number 4, what kind of patch and corridor are ideal? And that concludes this podcast, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.